I would begin with two pieces of background to set Syria into a world context. One is that from 1990 for 2 decades, the biggest untold good news story in the world was the expansion of the global zone of peace. There were 50 armed conflicts in 1990 when the Cold War ended. There was a spike to about 1994, then a decline every year, bottoming out in the 2007 period. And in 2010, there were 30 armed conflicts. For last year, for 2015, the count by the Uppsala Department of Peace and Conflict Research is 50. So we've gone back up to the end of the Cold War, to that level. So the last 5 years, which is the period also of the Syrian armed conflict, more or less, is a period of increasing armed conflict worldwide. And Syria, for all its specificities and peculiarities, needs to be understood partly in that context. Then the second thing is the Arab Spring, 2011, the moment of hope. Looking back 5 years now, it doesn't seem so much like a spring as the beginning of maybe a decade or a decade and a half of widespread insecurity. So there is a regional political process going on, of which Syria was a part. It started as a civil war, partly inspired by the democratic movements and mobilizations in other countries. I think then you start to move into the specificities of Syria. On the one hand, really an unexpectedly brutal response by the Assad regime, far beyond what Gaddafi was even threatening. Extraordinary use of violent means on a large scale, but also, which I think is particularly sort of horrifying, is on a small scale as well, targeting the specific families of people who were on the demonstrations and so on. I mean, it was ruthless. It was unexpected because Assad, if you remember, 5 years back, he was interpreted as sort of almost like the reluctant president. You know, he hadn't been the son who was going to take over. It was the older son who was going to take over from Hafez al-Assad. And then Bashar was an ophthalmologist working in London. He has a British life. He was settled down, nice, prosperous lifestyle. And back he had to go to Damascus. And there was a kind of expectation all through his first decade in power that, you know, yes, he would agree to an amelioration of the regime, of the worst parts of it, because of his background, and it turned out not to be true. Then the second element which comes into play on the back of that very, very brutal and hostile response to the pressure for change is the geopolitics. And that's what brings in Hezbollah, the largely Shiite political party in Lebanon, and Iran, because of Assad's and Syria's importance in the regional power game. And then, making all of that worse, you know, the next layer that comes in over the top is the Sunni revolution. This is what brings Islamic State into play. Islamic State in Iraq, to begin with, the Iraq branch of Al-Qaeda, expanding into Syria, becoming ISIS, falling out with Al-Qaeda, so there's now two Al-Qaeda franchises fighting it out in both Syria and in Iraq. And this is a story which goes back beyond the American-led invasion and occupation of Iraq in 2003. It really goes back to developments in Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Egypt in the 1960s and into the 70s, Saudi in the 1970s into the 1980s. So this again is a very kind of deeply embedded part of regional history, which of course also takes in partly the story in Afghanistan. So you have all of these different threads coming in together. This is what makes the war both so vicious and so intractable.